hope that the students feel a sense of accomplishment. I hope they feel proud about what they created. I hope they feel like they, really can do anything.
I want to dance for the rest of my life because I've been doing it up until now, so I still want to do it forever.
You taught me this in Dance 1, that dance is like a universal language.
And over time, I've really realized that my role here has become not necessarily teaching them about the art form of dance, but using dance as a way to understand yourself in the world. And when you understand yourself, then you are able to do more.
So I can say personally, the connection you have with your students and that you want them to do better. You want them to push. You don't want them to fall like under any category. You want them to push forward, and her sense of being a community, I'm about to cry. You can really see that. You want to be a community and you push for that. You push for your students so they can have a community. I told you dance ensemble is family. So you push for that. You push for the family. You push for us being together, even though times may be hard, the being there, present in time and space, was really something that I appreciate.
Life is gonna go back to normal, and what you gonna do when you look back from 4 years in high school and you know you didn't still push yourself?
Enjoy the moments, enjoy what you have, be here, be grateful for what you have, because we couldn't have done this. We didn't have to do this, or we were probably wouldn't be able to do this.
COVID kind of makes you do things you don't want to do, or forces you outside of your comfort zone a little bit.
Be open, be different. It's okay to not just think everything's gonna be one way. It's okay to change.
I grow every day, so it's not like I'm just stuck in one position. I've learned a lot about myself through this whole experience.
It takes confidence to be a leader, to be able to step out in front of people and say, this is the way that this should be done. Because you have to be able to take criticism from people that doing that as well, because everyone's looking to you.
If you ask for things, if you are open and you're willing to put yourself out there just a little bit, that things will come to you.
Okay, welcome everybody to the May 25th. I'm looking at the minutes from the last meeting. Meeting of the Audit and Accountability Committee. Mr. Sankowski, would you take the roll, please?
Sure. Ms. Beckerly?
Yes.
Ms. Vera?
Yes.
Mr. Grant?
Yes.
Mr. Vadjon?
Yes.
Ms. Reyes? Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Daniel? I believe you have a quorum.
Okay, thank you. The first order of business is to approve the minutes from our last meeting. Seeing no objection, those minutes.
To approve.
A motion to approve. Second.
All right, those minutes are approved. Moving right along to our next item, which is the committee operations, internal auditor position, chief auditor, executive position. I want to update the committee and first request some grace from all of you who have been serving in the Office of Internal Audit for the past few months. We know that it's been hard in the absence of not having an internal auditor appointed or even an interim, but we needed to make the main thing, and at the moment it was a superintendent search, and we're happy to have that settled, and we're excited about our new superintendent, and so we're starting to turn our attention to finding an interim auditor. So we hope to have some announcements to you shortly about who that might person be, and in the meantime, what I also want to share with you is that our hope for this position of internal auditor is not only someone to serve in that role, but to also help us in sorting through how your work should be structured vis-a-vis risk management, risk assessment, and compliance, things we've been talking about now for quite a while, and we're hoping that we are going to use this opportunity to sort through organizationally how those functions should all be handled, allocated, and set up to better support our organization. So we're going to need everyone's input and support during that process to come up with a plan that makes sense, and that includes you, James Barnes. I see. A welcome to our Zoom attendees, because it's an organizational thing, and we have to make sure our silos are broken down and that we're all working together, and that we don't, we have those three functions covered organizationally. So stay tuned. We'll keep you posted as we proceed along those fronts. Do you have anything else to add, Vice President?
Oh, no, I just want to thank the committee also, because there's been a lot of conversation that I've heard from Chair Beckerly just in terms of your thoughts and your suggestions. And so we sincerely appreciate those thoughts and suggestions, because that is critical to how we want to be able to move this process forward. And so certainly we will be not just kind of checking back in, but we will be coming back to you for additional insight and perspective as we continue to move this process forward.
Yes. Thank you, Vice President. Okay, and next on our agenda is the fiscal year 2024 risk assessment and proposed work. Mr. Sankowski, could you take over for that?
Sure. Carolyn distributed last week. You could have a multi-page document that looks like this. Essentially, this document is the same document that was proposed or presented last year. I think it's important to make sure that we all recognize and understand where we are in this process and what this document represents. As noted at the top of the document, while it looks very much like it did last year, this is not, at least in our perspective, considered an audit plan, simply because it's required that the chief audit executive present that audit plan, as well as the standards require that be presented as the owner of the upcoming plan. And so I just want to make sure that we're all of the understanding that this is not that at this time, simply because we don't have a chief audit executive. So what we ended up doing is, based on the risk assessment work, is putting together this list of what we would call recommended work based on the results of the risk assessment. You've had that document. She sent that out last week. Rather than maybe going over any of the particular things, hopefully you've had a chance to digest it. The second tab on that document was the actual risk assessment results. Now those are in summary form. Our actual risk assessment product is in our audit management system, where we document all of the characteristics of the audit units that lead to those ratings that you see in front of you. And then the subsequent tabs to that are really just explanatory tabs, such as the risk drivers and the risk variables that we have within our risk assessment, and then also some information about how we evaluate those characteristics. And then I think the final tab has to do with just the scoring and an explanation of how we score the different variables within the risk assessment. So then, based on the risk assessment final results, what we tried to do is we tried to focus on all of those audit units that had rated out as high risk, and those would be the red items. And so we have, on the first tab, proposed, or recommended, I should say, recommended work to try to address those high risk items that are on the second tab. Some of them are through audit work, some of them are through possibly engaging external parties for specialty purposes. Some of them are just some high-level touch type of things, not really audit work, but it was something we would recommend to at least give us some contact with those high-risk items.
Anybody have any questions or thoughts?
Probably something else to be sure to point out that everyone understands is on that front there, you have two columns at the far end that are for FTEs from 2022 and one for 2024. While they are on this recommended work because they've already been approved, I really don't have any assurance that any work that's going to be assigned to them will actually get done. And that's simply because I don't think those positions are going to actually be filled, even though they've been approved. And so again, I wanted to at least recognize them as being approved FTE work that if we actually had those folks, those are things that we could cover. But like I said, I don't really have any assurance that those are going to actually be filled, and so that we would be able to achieve any of the work that we've assigned to them.
So just to make sure I'm clear on what you're talking about, Kevin, you're talking about that top row where you had 14 and then 9? No.
Correct. That entire column.
Right.
Yeah, I titled FY 2022 FTE and FY 2024 FTE.
So what I'm lost in terms of what positions are you worried about not being filled?
Either of those two. Because we've been unsuccessful so far in getting the FY 22 approved FTE through our HR department, and so I don't have any assurance or any belief that they're going to also now fill the FY 24 one.
So the 9 are additional?
Say again, the 9?
The 2024 9 would be in addition to the 14. That's what has me confused, those numbers.
Well, it's that entire column. It's the work assigned to those down that entire column. So it's the...
So in essence, the total available resources, if you look down at column D, would be 2,500 hours left. So you would have 10,500 available because you have 2,500 that would be in those two unfilled positions, if I read that right.
Correct.
Right.
Okay, now I understand. Okay, thank you. That's noted.
Kevin, were there any major changes in a risk assessment from last year? Any particular areas that stood out?
Nothing I don't think that you wouldn't really understand or wouldn't expect. All the high-risk areas like transportation, safety, security. Maybe I think one of the new ones or newer ones is strategic performance. Strategic performance plays a huge role in our goals and guardrails. And so clearly that's a high-risk area that would deserve, or we would recommend have some attention spent on it.
So I am looking at the risk definitions, impact probability. Oh, I lost risk variables and drivers. And I think I'm looking at the drivers category. So is this where I would see, I just got louder there for a second. The goals and guardrails taken into account as one of the risk drivers, is this the place where that gets folded in, or where?
Specifically, the goals and guardrails, no, do not get baked into the risk assessment process. Those drivers that you see there are more, I guess, conceptual type topics. Do they have controls? Do they report internally performance information? Do they report externally performance information? Things like how the unit operates as far as whether it increases the risk for that unit is really the focus of our risk assessment. When it comes to the goals and guardrails, that would get baked in during any audit that was identified for the coming year. So none of the audit scopes are defined at this point, simply because we can't define the audit scopes yet. Our job at this point is to define what are the risky units.
Right.
And then subsequently, when we engage or do the work, we look for those areas that we believe to be high risk within those areas, the sub-processes we call them, within a particular unit. And then with the focus of goals and guardrails is determining how we can do an audit that helps to align with whatever the unit does in support of the goals and guardrails.
So you're identifying the risk without reference to the goals and guardrails, and then once you look at the risks more closely, or you sort through the highest risks, then that's when you take into account?
When we developed a scope for the audit, this is just to set which units are high-risk units to the organization that could have a large or significant impact item take place that would then not allow us to be successful in attaining our goals and guardrails.
Right.
Right. So, but it's not specific to each of the individual goals and guardrails that we set. Like I said, it's more conceptual in that does the audit unit operate in a particular way that somehow may have a significant impact or a significant likelihood of a risk event taking place that would then hinder our ability to be successful in achieving our goals and guardrails or any other strategic objectives that the organization sets.
Okay.
But the actual contribution to individual goals and guardrails is not determined until the audit scope is determined. You know, whether or not, let's say, strategic performance and the reporting on third grade reading guarantee, you know, that specific thing regarding the goal and closing the reading gaps and how we measure third grade reading guarantee success is more a context of a audit scope or thing that we would consider in determining an audit scope that we would audit. It doesn't play a part, though, in the actual risk assessment portion at this juncture.
But you could conceptually add another column that would have maybe to the right of reputational risk and have something to impact on achieving the long-term strategic goals of the district. And if it's something like student attendance, which is rated low, that might get rated higher because if students aren't attending, then there could be an impact on achieving the goals and objectives. Just it's a different filter way of looking at it.
Yeah, you definitely could. I think our look at it is in the context of what are your risk, what are the risk you're dealing with here in the most general sense is the risk of not achieving the goals and guardrails. Right. All right? So any risk event that takes place is going to have an impact on that. And though we are not specifically taking the goals and guardrails, each individual goal and guardrail into effect, what we're saying is that this unit operates because of who it reports to, how it has to report, whether we know that it has internal controls, whether or not it has had significant change in its leadership. Those things all have an impact on how that audit unit operates. And so we're assessing a risk that because of those things, that audit unit will have an impact on us achieving our goals and our guardrails. The bigger context of this is what we're trying to achieve. This is the risk that's created by this audit unit in whether or not we will or won't be able to achieve these items or their contribution to these items.
But it sounds like that's happening in this. It seems like that question is being answered before you came up with this risk assessment list. I mean, I'm looking through the high-risk areas, and they all kind of make sense to me in terms of our ability to achieve the goals and guardrails. See, purchasing and procurement, that's rated high. Now, typically, in a lot of operations, that's a huge risk to their ability to achieve their goals, because especially if it were a commercial enterprise, say. And I am not suggesting it shouldn't be rated high or should be rated high, but did we look at that vis-a-vis the goals and guardrails relative to, like, I see academic performance? Now, that one would be directly related to the goals and guardrails, so that's also rated high. So that I'm just wondering, but it seems to me we have to take a pass on it again through that lens in order to decide what the real priorities should be for the audit plan, but I'm not sure if, it sounds to me like you're kind of saying you took it into account already.
I don't think we look at it the same way you're looking at it.
Okay.
Is the thing. Like I said, we look at it as the end goal is achievement of the goals and guardrails and any other strategic objectives, all right, regardless of what they were. And so the end goal is that. Our risk assessment is what is the impact and likelihood of a risk event based on how the audit unit operates on, in our instance, the goals and guardrails and strategic objectives. But what this is defined as, what these are defined as, does not really play a part in our evaluation.
Okay. So I'm looking at the risk rating. So high is a risk event is almost certain to occur with a catastrophic impact resulting in one or more desired objectives falling below a minimum acceptable level. So the desired objectives.
We would not achieve the goals and guardrails.
That is that.
In the context of that statement, yes.
So it is sort of baked in.
So we just don't call them specifically in our language goals and guardrails, but wherever you see strategic objective or whatever.
Desired objectives.
In the case of a risk event, almost certain to occur with a catastrophic impact resulting on one or more desired objectives falling below a minimal accepted level, where it says one or more desired objectives falling below a minimum acceptable level, you could insert one or more goal or one or more of our guardrails falling below a minimum acceptable level.
Okay, that really helps a lot. Thanks.
But like I said, we don't define each of the three goals or consider what each of the three goals are, or any of the intermediate goals or any of the strategic priorities that have been identified. We're not doing any of this in the context against any of those specific items.
And are the IT risk areas not assigned a number for confidentiality reasons?
No, they're assessed differently than how we do it because we don't do it. OIA doesn't do the IT risk assessment. We contract with Schneider Downs to do that, and so their methodology is different than ours, and it doesn't correlate to a numbered structure like ours. They have similar terminology, and you have high, moderate, low.
Inception, right?
And the terminology of the risk identification is similar, but their methodology is different.
So will you report to us on that separately? Is that typically, I'm trying to remember in the past, I don't remember.
Yeah, we're trying to finalize the actual risk assessment. What you see as far as in here, I didn't include all of them, only the ones that we were proposing or recommending work on.
Okay.
But when we're all done, our next step is once we get the final report from them is to then share that with management, and then we would have a sharing with the committee.
All right.
So Kevin, the overall goal of this is to establish your work plan for 2024? Is that what we're trying to do?
Correct.
Okay. And do we know what the timeline is from moving from where we are now to, I know we don't have a director yet, but to implementing your audit plan for, because we're basically almost in June now. I mean, what's your thought as far as the timeline for implementation of this as you move forward?
It's really unknown because without the leadership and without the owner of a plan, we don't have anybody to say, yes, this is the plan, you ought to work. Like I said, this is recommended work that, if we had somebody who would own the function, they would be telling you that this is the plan, and July 1, we intend to implement this plan as soon as the committee is okay with it and as soon as it's approved by the Board of Education. But without that, the timing is such that I don't really know, because I don't know the timing of when that could actually take place.
How long does it take generally for field work to start from where you're approved to do an audit? So what's the timeline for planning, resource alignment, communications to the business? Is that a month or 6 weeks or what's
Usually some notifications. Kevin takes care of some notifications early in the fiscal year We try to schedule out what works best for the business as to when audit work would be appropriate or when it would be least invasive for them. So that usually takes place July-ish. And then we just start trying to plan and trying to arrange on schedules of when to actually do the work. Does that answer?
Yep.
Okay.
It would seem reasonable to me, in perspective of one, that we certainly, the input of this team who's experienced could bring forward to us the recommended work plan. And I think that there's enough experience on this group that could acknowledge that way the team could get moving on it. I'm certainly comfortable with that. And plans can change, so we may get into August, September and decide something else has a different priority, but I think it would not be good to, it may take a while to find another leader for the team. So perspective of one, I'd be comfortable with that.
Well, especially when we compare it to of not doing something.
Right. Right, and the team could put notation in the files that the most senior member brought forth the work plan, the committee discussed it, and we're okay with it. I think that will certainly keep you in line with the standards.
I don't know if it would or not. I think we're in some uncharted areas that I would, not totally understanding and respecting your experience, Greg, I would want to talk probably with someone as to whether it does or it doesn't, and how we document and how we do achieve, or at least how we disclose in our work that we couldn't or didn't comply, whatever that actually is. I mean, the charter and the standards to me seem very clear as to who is the owner of the function, and then thus who is the owner of the audit plan. And so, and it's not the executive director, or it's not a senior individual in the department. It's clearly in the standards and in the charter, the ownership of the chief audit executive.
I'd be happy to do your research.
Yeah,
I'd be happy to take a look as well,
Certainly.
because this situation happens all the time.
Right.
It's
I
not
was
unusual.
about to
Okay.
say that.
So it certainly can be done within the standards. But
Okay.
I appreciate the research. If you need some assistance, just reach out.
And we also have James Barnes, who is listening in, so I think that could also be something that we, Mr. Barnes, when you get a moment, that we could have conversation about this specific conversation, just to figure out what we can do to move forward in the interim of finding an interim for, you know.
If the board or committee were to name Mr. Barnes as he's the interim leader for the department, then certainly we can move forward with.
For administrative purposes.
Right, and this could certainly fall within that.
Okay.
That capacity.
And so, I suppose in part of our trying to run this down would be, you know, is there an order for the work to move forward? Does the board need to have a vote? Does the committee need to vote? Is Mr. Barnes' direction sufficient? Those seem to be the things that are hovering about in this conversation. And we very much appreciate this work to get us here so we have this decision point, because this is critical, and it's very much appreciated.
And from my point of view, I think it's good to know that we're not staying stagnant in regards to this interim period. We're still moving forward. So then knowing some tweaks might have to be made or things of that nature. And there is some plan of action as we move forward, because it might be a minute before we get the appropriate person in that place. So I do feel confident from that standpoint, and this body continuing to meet and question and make sure things are appropriate from our frame of reference.
That's really good input. Thank you.
And I did not mean to insinuate that July 1st we would simply sit still and not do anything, simply because we didn't have a chief audit executive. We're all experienced professionals that would definitely, I mean, carry out some work that was of value to the organization, whether it was based on an approved plan or other work that we believe is appropriate for us to do as the professionals that we were hired to do. You know, I may take some disagreement that it's an administrative function to have James Barnes approve the plan, simply because James has no insight into what actually needs to take place from an audit perspective. He has no understanding of the audit function. He has no understanding of the audit role, and I don't know that he has the ability to offer those things that are insightful to show what would be appropriate to audit. I mean, I may be wrong in that capacity, but you know, we've had no discussions with Mr. Barnes as to the direction of the department, the work of the department, or anything of that nature, and so that would be a new conversation that would take place.
Well, I think what we're trying to sort through is, based on the professionalism of your group and your having brought us this far, how to keep the work going forward and what action needs to be taken by either management or the board, and that's what we're sorting through. And it may be that the board proper needs to take the action, and then you would feel like you had sufficient authority to proceed.
Yeah, I mean, if it's just like an interim
We could just do it.
position, you know, that has the authority to move that forward.
I mean, we could bring a motion to the board, the next board meeting, and say, at our committee meeting, you know, the team presented this plan, and we would like to authorize them to go forward in the interim of the interim, as we were saying. And then would that satisfy you, Kevin, then, that you had the right direction? I mean, I'm not saying that's the right way to go necessarily, but that's one option. And then there's clarity. And that we would expect, you know, we'll try to do our research first about what sort of notes in the file would be appropriate, to Mr. Jordan's point.
And I think, Kevin, you were saying, does it meet the standards of the charter or the guidance that you have in place as far as who can set that agenda? And so to the extent that we can identify that it's consistent with the charter of the Office of Internal Audit, and that then you can move it forward, as we've satisfied that, then it gives you the authority to move forward with the plan.
Or even if we were to say the board recognizes the charter calls for X, but in this circumstance, we're directing the organization
I
to move
believe the
forward.
action is by the board, since there is none. The action has to take place by the board.
Okay, well, I'll review all of that, and we'll come up with a plan. All right, terrific. Thank you. Anything else on either of these two? The risk assessment or the work plan? I guess I sort of, sorting through these, the ranges, you know, 7 to 16, 16 to 26, and then 35. Is there anything in particular that, having gone through this process, you feel like we need to know about that should be elevated, or is it just sort of just the process that you normally undergo, and there's not any red alerts or anything, red being the color?
No, I don't have anything further.
Okay.
Kevin, the IT components, do we have somebody already identified that will be performing those or helping, assisting with those?
As far as external parties?
Yep.
No, we don't have anyone currently identified. I mean, our most recent contact has been with Schneider Downs to do some work in the past, as well as they've been the ones that have helped us with the risk assessment most recently. They seem like a natural partner. They have some understanding of the department and understanding of our organization, but we have not specifically reached out to anyone or identified anyone specifically as to who might best be able to serve us in that work. I think there's also some procurement, probably some procurement-related considerations we would have to take into account, depending on how much we think it might actually cost.
Circling back to that for a minute, there was some review that I think had to do with Schneider Downs that was to take place in April, when we met about this.
I believe it was request going for external assessment to go through FAC for funding, I think general approval, right, of funding.
Has any of that, where are we on that? Is that ringing a bell?
Well, the work we requested for Schneider Downs was in support of the risk assessment work. We're waiting on the final report to then share with management.
Okay, that's what I thought.
Share with the committee.
So then I'm confused about Mr. Vajon's question.
I believe it was related to the external, the vulnerability assessment or pen test that was going to the FAC that we discussed.
Oh, my apologies. I thought you were referring to the proposed work for FY '24. Because for one of the items we have for recommended work for FY '24, I think is IT third-party risk management, which we are recommending maybe to outsource that work. I thought you were referring to that work.
No, I was more answering to what Ms. Beckerly asked about.
Oh, okay.
So
You're
we're
talking
waiting-
about attack and penetration testing, which
And we're waiting to,
I'm not. I don't have any insight into where that stands.
Yeah, so that wouldn't be on your plan. That would be on the technology team's.
Correct.
assessment. But
okay,
but
that's,
for your third-party risk management, do we have approved funding for that? For sufficient funding?
Depending on what we ask them to do, I mean, our budget was cut by 30%. And so we'll have to see what available funding we have, and with that available funding, what it is we could ask them to do, and develop a scope of a project that would somehow afford that.
so that seems like something that we need to make sure we take up. And if we need to at the board level, to provide clear direction, to make sure that's in place.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Anything else? And the second item under Office of Internal Audit is discussion or action steps, open audit issues and recommendations. And this is something that we've been talking about on and off for a while now. And we were hoping to raise it again and maybe come up with an action plan going forward, or refining our thoughts anyway about how to address the items that are outstanding for significant periods of time. And, you know, how do we communicate with the board? What do we think about in terms of making sure that everyone's aware that this, these items exist, and that, you know, we've effectively assumed the risk for some of them, and others we may want to have a ability to discuss. And we'd like to gain the wisdom of the committee about how best to move forward on this front. I mean, the one possibility is to just share it with the board proper and just make them aware of it. I guess part of what I wondered about is there any wisdom in taking some of the longer outstanding items and deciding which of them are either no longer relevant, or we've essentially assumed the risk and they're not? You know, what are the things that are really worth discussing versus things that, you know, we don't want to get down rabbit holes we don't need to go down if they're already.
Yeah, right now they're just kind of numbers.
Yeah.
Report, and so we got to look at the detail behind them again.
Which they are.
And so we can really make a decision. Do we need to even continue to carry these on? Or is this something they've accepted the risk on, and it's such a low level that we really don't need to continue to show them on the report anymore? And if the board needs to know about those, I mean, we can give them a little more detail rather than just how many there are.
Right.
And then, you know, if they accept that risk, that's fine.
And then I'm wondering also if it would make sense, or it's advisable, that once we start doing this, we get it on the board agenda quarterly. So it's a continuing, because I think that's part of how these things end up languishing, is because we're not focusing on them. And so I'd be curious to know what, again, what would our criteria be for what gets elevated to a quarterly presentation? Is it just time alone, or is it time versus risk versus, is it red, yellow, green? You know, not green, because it wouldn't be green, but, you know, how do we decide what's worthy of elevating and what isn't. I mean, I think that's kind of a conversation to have. And then, Kevin, I'd be curious to know your take on some of this, because this is something that we've been talking about for a while in terms of elevating this. How to present it to the board, how to decide what to present to the board and how, and is it just an information, Are we asking the board to take an action item on it, or does it depend on what's on the list?
One quick question. So, as part of the onboarding of the new superintendent, is there a review of risks?
Oh.
That's where I was going to go.
That would be key.
Because ultimately, I wouldn't necessarily look to the Office of Internal Audit to bring forward that these risks should be accepted. I would expect somebody from the school district's
good point
administration that would raise that up and have an explanation and context as to why. So, to what Mr. Grant said, this risk is no longer relevant, or that the cost to implement mitigation, as an example, is significantly higher than the total exposure and the risk, right? So it doesn't make sense to implement $100,000 to fix a $10,000 exposure.
Right.
There could be other items, that we potentially, as a school district, we wouldn't want to compromise on, right? But I think that best position with something like that would be somebody like the if I'm looking to call him the superintendent or treasurer, right? So leader within that specific area. I think internal audit can definitely assist in that, right, and provide a perspective, but
it really is up to them to present it to the board and the.
Yep, I think from there it probably makes sense to go to the board.
So I wonder if the procedure we need to have is that there's some sort of a quarterly discussion between the Office of Internal Audit and the internal auditor and the superintendent, and then they collectively come together and say, this is where we are, and then the superintendent can say, I'm okay with this risk, I'm not okay with this risk, I don't think the board should be worried about this, so, or vice versa. And it also keeps it in front of the superintendent if it's something that's slipping through the cracks that they can force attention to.
Yep, and hopefully that the attention from the board would get you sufficient attention from
right. If they know the board's going to be looking at it, then everybody's going to be paying attention.
But it sounds right. I mean, you start with the key stakeholders that are involved in the process, get their buy-in, and then you can elevate it once they write off on it.
Okay, and then so then the question for us, Vice President Vera, is this a policy that we should be proposing, or an agenda strategy or something? You know, the board shall review quarterly I mean, I'm just thinking out loud here, and we can talk about this offline, but we have to figure out how to institutionalize it.
More of a procedure, versus a policy to me. So I think it's just, really identifying this procedure, looking at if there is a historical procedure that just maybe has not been followed. So I think looking at what's presently established now, and then from there looking at what's missing. But I feel it would probably be more a procedural than it would be.
Or you know what else I'm thinking? It might be something that we include in our monitoring calendar. Quarterly that would be doing this. All right.
We could talk about
We'll talk about it. She doesn't like my idea. It's okay.
Yeah, I think the question becomes how much effort, how long would it take to get through 200 issues to make sure they're still valid with management? And I don't know, is 2 hours an issue? I think something to think about, Kevin, with the team. Is it an hour an issue? I don't know. I think that'd be a good start, Mr. Grant's point, to get the list down to what's truly still should be outstanding. And then if the business wants to accept the risk, that's a procedural issue. I do think it'd be good to have Dr. Chapman be aware of all the open issues. I mean, the tone starts at the top. I think I've said
right.
Before, right?
So maybe what we do then is ask that Kevin and his team, or representatives from his team, meet with Dr. Chapman and her team to go over this list. Or has that happened already?
Quarterly, we've been sending the list out and asking for people to update the list and to give us change in status, and has it been implemented? Is it still outstanding? We've done that quarterly now for about the last year and a half or so.
Okay.
We have trouble getting responses from people to even respond to that request. So I mean, we can pull them aside and sit in meetings and specifically do that if that is the desire of the committee and the board. Whatever you think will be most effective in getting actual action, because that is the missing point, is getting actual action from folks, at a minimum even to acknowledge that it still exists. And then until, because I believe you're spot on in that management has to decide, is it relevant or is it not relevant? And those are the things we've tried to get for the last year and a half, and we've been unsuccessful.
Yeah. Well, I think to Chair Beckerly's initial point in question was if you were actually sitting down and talking with the superintendent or leadership specifically about the findings of the risk assessment. So I think it's, you know, to your point, you've been sending out the emails. So just looking at the strategy, if we're not getting the feedback we need from just sending the email, then we have to look at a different strategy to make sure that they're actually taking the time to look at the reports, ask questions if there are questions. And now that we have a new superintendent, this would be an opportunity to sit down and start looking at some procedural changes to ensure that everyone is in fact understanding the function and the priority area of audit, OIA as a whole. So to everyone's point, it is something that we have to be able to, you know, across the board, making sure that everybody understands this is a priority. But starting with our superintendent is going to be that first stopping point, I believe.
And I think combined with, we can share with the board when we report back on this meeting and this discussion, that we're recommending that we have a quarterly conversation about what's outstanding and what isn't after they've all had a chance to sort it through, so that we have it, the board proper is being presented with the risks that are outstanding or not outstanding. And that might change the nature of the conversation among the direct reports.
Yeah. And part of it's still educational too. I mean, a lot of times it's control that we're putting out there. Say, well, this control was not working, or it wasn't in place. But what is the true risk if that control isn't in effect? And so it's really making them understand, hey, if you're not doing this procedure, this is the potential that it could cause. And so once they understand what the potential risk is, then maybe they can truly understand if they can accept that or not.
Okay. So, I mean, I think that what'll change, hopefully, Kevin, to your point, is that we're going to implement a expectation that the board hear about this. Is quarterly the right time, or should it be biannually? I don't want to add more work than we should be doing to our staff.
I would say probably quarterly at this point, based upon administrative changes, so we're on top of it. Because in a nutshell, I think internal audit's done a real good job of identifying these risks time and time again, but showing the roadblocks. So it just kind of needs to be cleaned up from that standpoint, and then the interaction, whatever, between the departments and areas.
All right, terrific. Well, I really appreciate this conversation.
Yeah, and I think find a way with working with Dr. Chapman to risk management, these types of items, and there could be others, ought to be part of the senior leadership's performance objectives.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just,
absolutely.
You know, not responding, ignoring risk for, you know, a couple of years, just, you know, that doesn't cut it.
Appropriate. I think this is the one I added, just the culture and strategy for breakfast. So I think we need to understand just, and I don't know that I'm in the right position, what, you know, how do things get done in the school district, and what is the right motivation for folks to look at things. So I think most organizations, right, the tone starts at the top and goes down, so.
Yeah. Thank you.
All righty. And I think,
Chair Beckerly, may I say something?
of course.
In regards to the discussion regarding meeting with Superintendent Chapman and leadership, I think that's more than appropriate, because I would venture to say that not all of the leadership understands how audit got to where it got. And when you look at the one example is impact score versus likelihood score. I'm confident that not, and how do you get to the total risk score? I'm confident that not all understand that.
Okay, that's a good point. That'll be part of the conversation then.
Yes.
All righty. Thanks, Mr. Barnes.
Thank you.
All right, does anyone have anything else they'd like to share? Because we have no items under the rest of the agenda. All right.
A motion, we adjourn.
Second. Oh, I don't second. Can somebody second? Second. All right, seeing no objection, we are adjourned, and thank you, everyone. We appreciate it.